Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are reading The Birth of Tragedy. I will probably upload this in two parts. It is the last of the works of Nietzsche that I am reading for our challenge, and however, it is the first chronologically of the ones in our selection that Nietzsche wrote. But with that said, I will waste no more of your time. This work is split into 25 little sections. It's not very long, and I will probably stop around section 12 and then do a second video and go from section 13 to the end. With that said, I'll get started. 1. We shall have gained much for the science of aesthetics when once we have perceived, not only by logical inference, but by the immediate certainty of intuition, that the continuous development of art is bound up with the duplexity of the Apollonian and Dionysian, in like manner as procreation is dependent on the duality of the sexes, involving perpetual conflicts with only periodically intervening reconciliations. These names we borrow from the Greeks, who disclose to the intelligent observer the profound mysteries of their view of art, not indeed in concepts, but in the impressively clear figures of their world of deities. It is in connection with Apollo and Dionysus, the two art deities of the Greeks, that we learn that there existed in the Grecian world a wide antithesis in origin and aims between the art of the shaper, the Apollonian, and the non-plastic art of music, that of Dionysus. Both these so heterogeneous tendencies run parallel to each other, for the most part openly at variance, and continually inciting each other to new and more powerful births, to perpetuate in them the strife of this antithesis, which is but seemingly bridged over by their mutual term, art, till at last by a metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic will, they appear paired with each other, and through this pairing eventually generate the equally Dionysian and Apollonian artwork of Attic tragedy. In order to bring these two tendencies within closer range, let us conceive them first of all as the separate art worlds of dreamland and drunkenness, between which physiological phenomena a contrast may be observed analogous to that existing between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. In dreams, according to the conception of Lucretius, the glorious divine figures first appeared to the souls of men. In dreams, the greater shaper beheld the charming corporeal structure of superhuman beings. And the Hellenic poet, if consulted on the mysteries of poetic inspiration, would likewise have suggested dreams and would have offered an explanation resembling that of Hans Sachs and the Meistersingers. Quote, "My friend, just this is poet's task, his dreams to read and to unmask. Trust me, illusion's truths, thrice sealed, in dream to man will be revealed. All verse-craft and poetization is but soothed dream interpretation." End quote. The beauteous appearance of the dream worlds, and the production of which every man is a perfect artist, is the presupposition of all plastic art, and in fact, as we shall see, of an important half of poetry also. We take delight in the immediate apprehension of form. All forms speak to us. There is nothing indifferent, nothing superfluous. But together with the highest life of this dream reality we also have, glimmering through it, the sensation of its appearance. Such at least is my experience as to the frequency, normality, of which I could adduce many proofs, as also the sayings of the poets. Indeed, the man of philosophic turn has a foreboding that underneath this reality in which we live and have our being, another and altogether different reality lies concealed, and that therefore it is also in appearance. And Schopenhauer actually designates the gift of occasionally regarding men and things as mere phantoms and dream pictures as the criterion of philosophical ability. Accordingly, the man susceptible to art stands in the same relation to the reality of dreams as the philosopher to the reality of existence. He is a close and willing observer, for from these pictures he reads the meaning of life, and by these processes he trains himself for life. And it is perhaps not only the agreeable and friendly pictures that he realizes in himself with such perfect understanding, the earnest, the troubled, the dreary, the gloomy, the sudden checks, the tricks of fortune, the uneasy presentiments, in short, the whole divine comedy of life, and the inferno also pass before him, not merely like pictures on the wall, for he too lives and suffers in these scenes, and yet not without that fleeting sensation of appearance. And perhaps many a one will, like myself, recollect having sometimes called out cheeringly, and not without success, amid the dangers and terrors of dream life, "It is a dream, I will dream on." I have likewise been told of persons capable of continuing the causality of one and the same dream for 3 and even more successive nights, all of which facts clearly testify that our innermost being, the common substratum of all of us, experiences our dreams with deep joy and cheerful acquiescence. This cheerful acquiescence in the dream experience has likewise been embodied by the Greeks in their Apollo. For Apollo, as the god of all shaping energies, is also the soothsaying god. He who, as the etymology of the name indicates, is the shining one, the deity of light, also rules over the fair appearance of the inner world of fantasies. The higher truth, the perfection of these states in contrast to the only partially intelligible everyday world, the deep consciousness of nature, healing and helping in sleep and dream, is at the same time the symbolical analogue of the faculty of soothsaying, and in general of the arts, through which life is made possible and worth living, but also that delicate line which the dream picture must not overstep, lest it act pathologically, in which case appearance, being reality pure and simple, would impose upon us, must not be wanting in the picture of Apollo. That measured limitation, that freedom from the wilder emotions, that philosophical calmness of the sculptor god. His eye must be sun-like, according to his origin. Even when it is angry and looks displeased, the sacredness of his beauteous appearance is still there. And so we might apply to Apollo, in an eccentric sense, what Schopenhauer says of the man wrapped in the veil of Maya. Quote, "Just as in a stormy sea, unbounded in every direction, rising and falling with howling mountainous waves, a sailor sits in a boat and trusts in his frail bark, so in the midst of a world of sorrows, the individual sits quietly, supported by and trusting in his principium individuationis." Indeed, we might say of Apollo that in him the unshaken faith in this principium and the quiet sitting of the man wrapped therein have received their sublimest expression, and we might even designate Apollo as the glorious divine image of the principium individuationis, from out of the gestures and looks of which all the joy and wisdom of quote-unquote appearance, together with its beauty, speak to us. In the same work, Schopenhauer has described to us the stupendous awe which seizes upon man, when of a sudden he is at a loss to account for the cognitive forms of a phenomenon, and that the principle of reason, in some one of its manifestations, seems to admit of an exception. Add to this the awe, the blissful ecstasy which rises from the innermost depths of man, of nature, at the same collapse of the principium individuationis, and we shall gain an insight into the being of the Dionysian, which is brought within closest ken, perhaps, by the analogy of drunkenness. It is either under the influence of the narcotic draught, of which the hymns of all primitive men and peoples tells us, or by the powerful approach of spring penetrating all nature with joy, that those Dionysian emotions awake, and the augmentation of which the subjective vanishes to complete self-forgetfulness. So also in the German Middle Ages, singing and dancing crowds, ever increasing in number, were borne from place to place under the same Dionysian power. In these St. John's and St. Vitus's dancers, we again perceive the Bacchic choruses of the Greeks, with their previous history in Asia Minor, as far back as Babylon and the orgiastic Sacaea. There are some who, from lack of experience or obtuseness, will turn away from such phenomena as quote-unquote folk diseases, with a smile of contempt or pity prompted by the consciousness of their own health. Of course, the poor wretches do not divine what a cadaverous-looking and ghastly aspect this very health of theirs presents when the glowing life of the Dionysian revelers rushes past them. Under the charm of the Dionysian, not only is the covenant between man and man again established, but also estranged, hostile or subjugated nature again celebrates her reconciliation with her lost son, man. Of her own accord, earth proffers her gifts, and peacefully the beasts of prey approach from the desert and the rocks. The chariot of Dionysus is bedecked with flowers and garlands. Panthers and tigers pass beneath his yoke. Change Beethoven's Jubilee song into a painting, and if your imagination be equal to the occasion when the awestruck millions sink into the dust, you will then be able to approach the Dionysian. Now was the slave a free man, now all the stubborn, hostile barriers which necessity, caprice, or shameless fashion has set up between man and man are broken down. Now, at the evangel of cosmic harmony, each one feels himself not only united, reconciled, blended with his neighbor, but as one with him, as if the veil of Maya had been torn, and were now merely fluttering in tatters before the mysterious primordial unity. In song and in dance, man exhibits himself as a member of a higher community. He has forgotten how to walk and speak, and is on the point of taking a dancing flight into the air. His gestures bespeak enchantment, even as the animals now talk, and as the earth yields milk and honey, so also something supernatural sounds forth from him. He feels himself a god. He himself now walks about enchanted and elated even as the gods whom he saw walking about in his dreams. Man is no longer an artist. He has become a work of art. The artistic power of all nature here reveals itself in the tremors of drunkenness to the highest gratification of the primordial unity. The noblest clay, the costliest marble, namely man, is here kneaded and cut, and the chisel strokes of the Dionysian world artist are accompanied with the cry of the Eleusinian mysteries. Quote, "To bow in the dust, O millions, thy maker mortal dost divine." End quote. 2. Thus far we have considered the Apollonian and his antithesis, the Dionysian, as artistic powers which burst forth from nature herself without the mediation of the human artist, and in which her art impulses are satisfied in the most immediate and direct way. First, as the pictorial world of dreams, the perfection of which has no connection whatever with the intellectual height or artistic culture of the unit man, and again as drunken reality, which likewise does not heed the unit man, but even seeks to destroy the individual and redeem him by a mystic feeling of oneness. Anent these immediate art states of nature, every artist is either an imitator, to wit, either an Apollonian, an artist in dreams, or a Dionysian, an artist in ecstasies, or finally, as for instance in Greek tragedy, an artist in both dreams and ecstasies. So we may perhaps picture him, as in his Dionysian drunkenness and mystical self-abnegation, lonesome and apart from the reveling choruses. He sinks down, and how now, through Apollonian dream inspiration, his own state, i.e., his oneness with the primal source of the universe, reveals itself to him in a symbolical dream picture. After these general premisings and contrastings, let us now approach the Greeks in order to learn what degree and to what height these art impulses of nature were developed in them, whereby we shall be enabled to understand and appreciate more deeply the relation of the Greek artist to his archetypes, or, according to the Aristotelian expression, the imitation of nature. In spite all of the dream literature and the numerous dream anecdotes of the Greeks, We can speak only conjecturally, though with a fair degree of certainty of their dreams. Considering the incredibly precise and unerring plastic power of their eyes, as also their manifest and sincere delight in colors, we can hardly refrain, to the shame of everyone born later, from assuming for their very dreams a logical causality of lines and contours, colors and groups, a sequence of scenes resembling their best reliefs, the perfection of which would certainly justify us, if a comparison were possible, in designating the dreaming Greeks as Homer's and Homer as a dreaming Greek, in a deeper sense than when modern man, in respect to his dreams, ventures to compare himself with Shakespeare. On the other hand, we should not have to speak conjecturally if asked to disclose the immense gap which separated the Dionysian Greek from the Dionysian barbarian. From all quarters of the ancient world, to say nothing of the modern, from Rome as far as Babylon, we can prove the existence of Dionysian festivals, the types of which bears, at best, the same relation to the Greek festivals as the bearded satyr, who borrowed his name and attributes from the goat, does to Dionysus himself. In nearly every instance, the center of these festivals lay in extravagant sexual licentiousness, the waves of which overwhelmed all family life and its venerable traditions. The very wildest beasts of nature were let loose here, including that detestable mixture of lust and cruelty which has always seemed to me the genuine witches' draught. For some time, however, it would seem that the Greeks were perfectly secure and guarded against the feverish agitations of these festivals, the knowledge of which entered Greece by all the channels of land and sea, by the figure of Apollo himself, rising here in full pride, who could not have held out to the Gorgon's head to a more dangerous power than this grotesquely uncouth Dionysian. It is in Doric art that this majestically rejecting attitude of Apollo is perpetuated itself. This opposition became more precarious and even impossible when, from out of the deepest root of the Hellenic nature, similar impulses finally broke forth and made way for themselves. The Delphic god, by a seasonably effected reconciliation, was now contented with taking the destructive arms from the hands of his powerful antagonist. This reconciliation marks the most important moment in the history of the Greek cult. Wherever we turn our eyes, we may observe the revolutions resulting from this event. It was the reconciliation of two antagonists, with the sharp demarcation of the boundary lines to be thenceforth observed by each, and with periodical transmission of testimonials. In reality, the chasm was not bridged over. But if we observe how, under the pressure of this conclusion of peace, the Dionysian power manifested itself, we shall now recognize in the Dionysian orgies of the Greeks, as compared with the Babylonian Sacaea, and their retrogression of man to the tiger and the ape, the significance of festivals, of world redemption, and days of transfiguration. Not till then does nature attain her artistic jubilee. Not till then does the rupture of the principium individuationis become an artistic phenomenon. That horrible witch's draught of sensuality and cruelty was here powerless. Only the curious blending and duality in the emotions of the Dionysian revelers reminded one of it, just as medicines remind one of deadly poisons. That phenomenon, to wit, that pain begets joy, that jubilation rings painful sounds out of the breast. From the highest joy sounds the cry of horror or the yearning wail of an irretrievable loss. In these Greek festivals, a sentimental trait, as it were, breaks forth from nature, as if she must sigh over her dismemberment into individuals. The song and pantomime of such dually-minded revelers was something new and unheard of in the Homeric Grecian world, and in the Dionysian music in particular excited awe and horror. If music, as it would seem, was previously known as an Apollonian art, it was, strictly speaking, only as the wave beat of rhythm, the formative power of which was developed to the representation of Apollonian conditions. The music of Apollo was Doric architectonics in tones, but in merely suggested tones, such as those of the cithara. The very element which forms the essence of Dionysian music, and hence of music in general, is carefully excluded as un-Apollonian, namely the thrilling power of the tone, the uniform stream of the melos, and the thoroughly incomparable world of harmony. In the Dionysian Dithraeum, man is incited to the highest exaltation of all his symbolic faculties. Something never before experienced struggles for utterance, the annihilation of the veil of Maya. Oneness as genius of the race, of nature. The essence of nature is now to be expressed symbolically. A new world of symbols is required. For once, the entire symbolism of the body, not only the symbolism of the lips, face, and speech, but the whole pantomime of dancing which sets all the members into rhythmical motion. Thereupon, the other symbolic powers, those of music and rhythmics, dynamics, and harmony, suddenly become impetuous. To comprehend this collective discharge of all the symbolic powers, a man must have already attained that height of self-abnegation, which wills to express itself symbolically through these powers. The dithyrambic votary of Dionysus is therefore understood only by those like himself. With what astonishment must the Apollonian Greek have beheld him! With an astonishment which was all the greater the more it was mingled with the shuddering suspicion that all this was in reality not so very foreign to him, yea, that like unto a veil his Apollonian consciousness only hid this Dionysian world from his view. 3. In order to comprehend this, we must take down the artistic structure of the Apollonian culture, as it were, stone by stone, till we behold the foundations on which it rests. Here we observe first of all the glorious Olympian figures of the gods, standing on the gables of this structure, whose deeds, represented in far-shining reliefs, adorn its friezes. Though Apollo stands among them as an individual deity, side by side with others, and without claim to priority of rank, we must not suffer this fact to mislead us. The same impulse which embodied itself in Apollo has in general given birth to this whole Olympian world, and in this sense we may regard Apollo as the father thereof. What was the enormous need from which proceeded such an illustrious group of Olympian beings? Whosoever, with another religion in his heart, approaches these Olympians and seeks among them for moral elevation, even for sanctity, for incorporeal spiritualization, for sympathetic looks of love, will soon be obliged to turn his back on them, discouraged and disappointed. Here nothing suggests asceticism, spirituality, or duty. Here only an exuberant, even triumphant life speaks to us, in which everything existing is deified, whether good or bad. And so the spectator will perhaps stand quite bewildered before this fantastic exuberance of life, and ask himself what magic potion these madly merry men could have used for enjoying life, so that wherever they turned their eyes, Helena, the ideal image of their own existence, floating in sweet sensuality, smiled upon them. But to this spectator, already turning backwards, we must call out, "Depart not hence, but hear rather what Greek folk wisdom says of this same life, which with such inexplicable cheerfulness spreads out before thee." There is an ancient story that King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Silenus, the companion of Dionysus, without capturing him. When at last he fell into his hands, the king asked what was best of all and most desirable for man. Fixed and immovable, the demon remained silent, till at last, forced by the king, he broke out with shrill laughter into these words: "O wretched race of a day, children of chance and misery, why do you compel me to say to you what it were most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is forever beyond your reach. Not to be born, not to be nothing. The second best for you, however, is soon to die." How is the Olympian world of deities related to this folk wisdom? even as the rapturous vision of the tortured martyr to his sufferings. Now the Olympian magic mountain opens, as it were, to our view and shows to us its roots. The Greek knew and felt the terrors and horrors of existence. To be able to live at all, he had to interpose the shining dream birth of the Olympian world between himself and them. The excessive distrust of the titanic powers of nature, the Mora throning inexorably over all knowledge, the vulture of the great philanthropist Prometheus, the terrible fate of the wise Oedipus, the family curse of the Atridae which drove Orestes to matricide. In short, that entire philosophy of the Sylvan god with its mythical exemplars, which wrought the ruin of the melancholy Etruscans, was again and again surmounted anew by the Greeks through the artistic middle world of the Olympians, or at least veiled and withdrawn from sight. To be able to live, the Greeks had, from direst necessity, to create these gods, which process we may perhaps picture to ourselves in this manner, that out of the original Titan thearchy of terror, the Olympian thearchy of joy was evolved, by slow transitions through the Apollonian impulse to beauty, even as roses break forth from thorny bushes. How else could this so sensitive people, so vehement in its desires, so singularly qualified for sufferings, have endured existence, if it had not been exhibited to them in their gods, surrounded with a higher glory? The same impulse which calls art into being as the complement and consummation of existence, seducing to a continuation of life, caused also the Olympian world to arise, in which the Hellenic will held up before itself a transfiguring mirror. Thus do the gods justify the life of man, and that they themselves live it, the only satisfactory theodicy. Existence under the bright sunshine of such gods is regarded as that which is desirable in itself, and the real grief of the Homeric men has reference to parting from it, especially to early parting, so that we might now say of them, with a reversion of the Selenian wisdom, that to die early is worst of all for them. The second worst is, some day to die at all. If once the lamentation is heard, it will ring out again of the short-lived Achilles, of the leaf-like change and vicissitude of the human race, of the decay of the heroic age. It is not unworthy of the greatest hero to long for a continuation of life, even as a day-laborer. So vehemently does the will, at the Apollonian stage of development, long for this existence. So completely at one does the Homeric man feel himself with it, that the very lamentation becomes its song of praise. Here we must observe that this harmony, which is so eagerly contemplated by modern man, in fact, this oneness of man with nature, to express which Schiller introduced the technical term naive, is by no means such a simple, naturally resulting, and, as it were, inevitable condition, which must be found at the gate of every culture leading to a paradise of man. This could be believed only by an age which sought to picture to itself Rousseau's Emile also as an artist, and imagined it had found in Homer such an artist Emile, reared at nature's bosom. Wherever we meet with the naive in art, it behooves us to recognize the highest effect of the Apollonian culture, which in the first place has always to overthrow some titanic empire and slay monsters, and which, through powerful dazzling representations and pleasurable illusions, must have triumphed over a terrible depth of world contemplation and a most keen susceptibility to suffering. But how seldom is the naive, that complete absorption in the beauty of appearance, attained? And hence how inexpressibly sublime is Homer, who, as unit being, bears the same relation to this Apollonian folk culture as the unit dream artist does to the dream faculty of the people and of nature in general. The Homeric naivete can be comprehended only as the complete triumph of the Apollonian illusion. It is the same kind of illusion as nature so frequently employs to compass her ends. The true goal is veiled by a phantasm. We stretch out our hands for the latter, while nature attains the former through our illusion. In the Greeks, the will desired to contemplate itself in the transfiguration of the genius and the world of art. In order to glorify themselves, its creatures had to feel themselves worthy of glory. They had to behold themselves again in a higher sphere, without this consummate world of contemplation acting as an imperative or reproach. Such is the sphere of beauty, in which, as in a mirror, they saw their images, the Olympians. With this mirroring of beauty, the Hellenic will combated its talent, correlative to the artistic, for suffering and for wisdom of suffering. And as a moment of its victory, Homer, the naive artist, stands before us. 4. Using the analogy of a dream, we can learn something about this naive artist. If we recall how the dreamer, in the middle of his illusory dream world, calls out to himself, without destroying that world, "It is a dream. I want to continue dreaming." And if we can infer, on the one hand, a deep inner delight at the contemplation of dreams, and on the other, that he must have completely forgotten the pressing problems of his daily life, in order to be capable of dreaming at all with such inner contemplative joy, then we may interpret all these phenomena, with the guidance of Apollo, the interpreter of dreams, in something like a manner which follows below. To be sure, with respect to both halves of life, the waking and the dreaming states, the first one strikes us as disproportionately better, more important, more valuable, more worth living, the only way to live. Nevertheless, I can assert something of a paradox to all appearances, on the basis of the secret foundation of our essence, whose manifestation we are, precisely the opposite evaluation of dreams. For the more I become aware of those all-powerful natural artistic impulses and the fervent yearning for illusion contained in them, the desire to be redeemed through appearances, the more I feel myself forced to the metaphysical assumption that the true basis of being, the ever-suffering and entirely contradictory primordial oneness, constantly uses the delightful vision, the joyful illusion, to redeem itself. We are compelled to experience this illusion, totally caught up in it and constituted by it, as the truly non-existent. That is, as a continuing development in time, space, and causality, in other words, as an empirical reality. But if we momentarily look away from our own reality, if we grasp our empirical existence and the world in general as an ideal of the primordial oneness created in each moment, then we must consider our dreams as illusions of illusions, as well as an even higher fulfillment of the primordial hunger for illusion. For the same reasons, the innermost core of nature takes an indescribable joy in the naive artist and naive works of art, which is, in the same way, only an illusion of an illusion. Raphael himself, one of those immortal naive artists, in one of his allegorical paintings, has presented that issue of transforming an illusion into an illusion, the fundamental process of the naive artist and Apollonian culture as well. In his Transfiguration, the bottom half shows us, in the possessed boy, the despairing porters and the helplessly frightened disciples, the mirror image of the eternal primordial pain, the sole basis of the world. The quote-unquote illusion here is the reflection of the eternal contradiction, the father of things. Now, out of this illusion there rises up, like an ambrosial fragrance, a new world of illusion. Like a vision, invisible to those trapped in the first scene, something illuminating and hovering in the purest, painless ecstasy, a shining vision to contemplate with eyes wide open. Here we have before our eyes, in the highest symbolism of art, that Apollonian world of beauty and its foundation, the frightening wisdom of Silenus, and we understand through intuition the reciprocal necessity for both of them. But Apollo confronts us once again as the divine manifestation of the individualizing principle, in which the eternally attained goal of the primordial oneness, its redemption through illusion, comes into being. He shows us with his awe-inspiring gestures how the entire world of torment is necessary, so that through it the individual is pushed to create the redemptive vision, and then, absorbed in contemplation of that vision, sits quietly in his rowboat, tossing around in the middle of the ocean. This deification of the principle of individualization, if it is thought of in general as commanding and prescriptive, understands only one law, that of the individual, that is, observing the limits of individualization, moderation in the Greek sense. Apollo, as the ethical divinity, demands moderation from his followers and self-knowledge so that they can observe moderation. And so alongside the aesthetic necessity of beauty run the demands know thyself and nothing in excess. Arrogance and excess are considered the essentially hostile daemons of the non-Apollonian sphere, therefore characteristic of the pre-Apollonian period, the age of the Titans, and of the world beyond the Apollonian, that is, the barbarian world. Because of his titanic love for mankind, Prometheus had to be ripped apart by the vulture. For the sake of his excessive wisdom, which solved the riddle of the Sphinx, Oedipus had to be overthrown in a bewildering whirlpool of evil. That is how the Delphic god interpreted the Greek past. To the Apollonian Greeks, the effect aroused by the Dionysian also seemed titanic and barbaric. But they could not, with that response, conceal that they themselves were, nonetheless, internally related and similar to those deposed Titans and heroes. Indeed, they must have felt even more that their entire existence, with all its beauty and moderation, rested on some hidden underground of suffering and knowledge, which was reawakened through that very Dionysian. And look, Apollo could not live without Dionysus. The titanic and the barbaric were, in the end, every bit as necessary as the Apollonian. And now let us imagine how in this world, constructed on illusion and moderation and restrained by art, the ecstatic sound of the Dionysian celebration rang out all around with a constantly tempting magic. How in such celebrations the entire excess of nature sang out loudly in joy, suffering, and knowledge, even in the most piercing scream. Let's imagine what the psalm-chanting Apollonian artist, with his ghostly harp music, could offer in comparison to this daemonic popular singing. The muses of the art of illusion withered away in the face of an art which spoke truth in its intoxicated state. The wisdom of Silenus cried out, "Woe, woe," against the serene Olympian. Individualism, with all its limits and moderation, was destroyed in the self-forgetfulness of the Dionysian condition and forgot its Apollonian principles. Excess revealed itself as the truth. The contradictory ecstasy born from pain spoke of itself right out of the heart of nature. And so the Apollonian was cancelled and destroyed, above all where the Dionysian penetrated. But it is just as certain that in those places where the first onslaught was halted, the high reputation and majesty of the Delphic god manifested itself more firmly and threateningly than ever. For I can explain the Doric state and the Doric art only as a constant Apollonian war camp. Only through an uninterrupted opposition to the titanic, barbaric essence of the Dionysian could such a defiantly aloof art, protected on all sides with fortifications, such a harsh upbringing as a preparation for war, and such a cruel and ruthless basis for government, endure. Up to this point, I have set out at some length what I observed at the opening of this essay, how the Dionysian and the Apollonian ruled the Hellenic world, in a constant sequence of births, one after the other, mutually intensifying each other, how, out of the first ages, with their battles of the Titans and their harsh popular philosophy, the Homeric world developed under the rule of the Apollonian drive for beauty, how this naive magnificence is swallowed up once more by the breaking out of the Dionysian torrent, and how in opposition to this new power, the Apollonian erected the rigid majesty of Doric art and the Doric world view. If in this way the ancient history of the Greeks and the struggle of these two hostile principles falls into four major artistic periods, we are now impelled to ask more about the final stage of this development and striving, in case we should consider the last attained period, the one of Doric art, as the summit and intention of these artistic impulses. Here, the lofty and highly much praised artistic achievement of Attic tragedy and the dramatic Dithrium presents itself before our eyes, as the common goal of both artistic drives, whose secret marriage partnership, after a long antecedent struggle, celebrated itself with such a child, simultaneously Antigone and Cassandra. We are now approaching the essential goal of our undertaking, which aims at a knowledge of the Dionysian Apollonian genius and its works of art, or at least an intuitive understanding of its mysterious unity. Here now we raise the question of where that new seed first appears in the Hellenic world, the seed which later develops into tragedy and the dramatic Dithrium. On this question, classical antiquity itself gives us illustrative evidence when it places Homer and Archilochus next to each other as the originators and torchbearers of Greek poetry and paintings, cameos, and so on, in full confidence that only these two should be considered equally the original natures from whom a firestorm flowed out over the entire later world of the Greeks. Homer, the ancient self-absorbed dreamer, the archetype of the naive Apollonian artist, now stares astonished at the passionate head of wild Archilochus, the fighting servant of the Muses, battered by existence. In its interpretative efforts, our recent aesthetics has known only how to indicate that here the first subjective artist stands in contrast to the objective artist. This interpretation is of little use, since we recognize the subjective artist as a bad artist, and demand in every art and every high artistic achievement, first and foremost, a victory over the subjective, redemption from the I, and the silence of every individual will and desire. Indeed, we are incapable of accepting the slightest artistic creation as true, unless it has objectivity and a purely disinterested contemplation. Hence, our aesthetic must first solve the problem of how it is possible for the lyricist to be an artist. For he, according to the experience of all ages, always says I, and sings out the entire chromatic sequence of the sounds of his passions and desires. This Archilochus immediately startles us, alongside Homer, through his cry of hate and scorn, through the drunken eruptions of his desire. By doing this, isn't Archilochus, the first artist called subjective, essentially a non-artist? But then where does the veneration come from, which the Delphic oracle, the center of quote-unquote objective art, showed to him, the poet, in very remarkable sayings? Schiller has illuminated his own writing process with a psychological observation, inexplicable to him, which nevertheless does not appear questionable. He confesses that when he was in a state of preparation, before he actually started writing, he did not have something like a series of pictures with a structured causality of ideas in front of him, but rather a musical mood. Quote, "With me, feeling at first lacks a defined and clear object that develops for the first time later on. A certain musical emotional state comes first, and from this, with me, the poetic idea then follows." End quote. Now, if we add the most important phenomenon of the entire ancient lyric, the union, universally acknowledged as natural, between the lyricist and the musician, even their common identity, in comparison with which our recent lyrics look like the image of a god without a head, then we can, on the basis of the aesthetic metaphysics we established earlier, account for the lyric poet in the following manner. He has, first of all, as a Dionysian artist, become entirely one with the primordial oneness of his painful, contradictory nature, and produces the reflection of this primordial oneness as music, if music can with justice be called a reworking of the world, its second coat. But now this music becomes perceptible to him once again, as in a metaphorical dream image, under the influence of Apollonian dreaming. That reflection, which lacks imagery and concepts of the original pain in music, together with its redemption in illusion, gives rise now to a second reflection as the particular metaphor or illustration. The artist has already surrendered his subjectivity in the Dionysian process. The image which now reveals his unity with the heart of the world is a dream scene, which symbolizes that original contradiction and pain, together with the primordial joy and illusion. The quote-unquote I of the lyric poet thus echoes out of the abyss of being. What recent aestheticians mean by his subjectivity is mere fantasy. When Archilochus, the first Greek lyric poet, announces his raging love and, at the same time, his contempt for the daughters of Lycombes, it is not his own passion which dances in front of us in an orgiastic frenzy. We see Dionysus and the Maenads. We see the intoxicated reveler Archilochus sunk down in sleep, as Euripides describes in the Bacchae, asleep in a high alpine meadow in the midday sun. And now Apollo steps up to him and touches him with his laurel. The Dionysian musical enchantment of the sleeper now, as it were, flashes around him in fiery images, lyrical poems, which are called in their highest form tragedies and dramatic dithrymbs. The plastic artist, as well as his relation to the epic poet, is absorbed in the pure contemplation of images. The Dionysian musician lacks any image and is in himself only and entirely the original pain and original reverberation of that image. The lyrical genius feels a world of images and metaphors grow up out of the mysteriously unified state of renunciation of the self. These have a color, causality, and speed entirely different from that world of the plastic artist and the writer of epic. While the last of these, the epic poet, lives in these pictures, and only in them with joyful contentment, and does not get tired of contemplating them with love, right down to the smallest details. Even the image of the angry Achilles is for him only a picture whose expressions of anger he enjoys with that dream of joy and illusions, so that he, by this mirror of appearances, is protected against the development of that sense of unity and being fused together with the forms he has created. By contrast, the images of the lyric poet are nothing but himself, and, as it were, only different objectifications of himself. He can say I because he is the moving central point of that world. Only this I is not the same as the I of the awake, empirically real man, but the single I of true and eternal being in general, the I resting on the foundation of things. Through its portrayal, the lyrical genius sees right into the very basis of things. Now let's imagine how he looks upon himself among these likenesses as a non-genius, that is, as his own subject, the entire unruly crowd of subjective passions and striving of his will aiming at something particular, which seems real to him. If it now seems as if the lyrical genius and the non-genius bound up with him were one and the same, and as if he spoke with that little word I about himself, then this illusion could no longer deceive us, not at least in the way it deceived those who have defined the lyricist as a subjective poet. To tell the truth, Archilochus, the man of passionately burning love and hate, is only a vision of the genius who is no longer Archilochus any more, but a world of genius who expresses his primordial pain symbolically in Archilochus as a metaphor for man. That subjectively willing and desiring man, Archilochus, can never be a poet. It is not at all essential that the lyric poet see directly in front of him the phenomenon of the man Archilochus as a reflection of eternal being. Tragedy shows how far the visionary world of the lyric poet can distance itself from that phenomenon clearly standing near at hand. Schopenhauer, who did not hide from the difficulty which the lyric poet creates for the philosophical observer of art, believed that he had discovered a solution, something which I cannot go along with, when in his profound metaphysics of music he found a way of setting the difficulty decisively to one side, as I believe I have done in his spirit and with due honor to him. He describes the essential nature of song as follows. The consciousness of the singer is filled with the subject of willing, that is, in his own willing often and an unleashed satisfied willing joy, but also, and more often, as a restricted willing sorrow. It is always a mobile condition of the heart, emotional and passionate. However, alongside this condition, the singer simultaneously, through a glimpse at the surrounding nature, becomes aware of himself as a subject of the pure, will-less knowledge, whose imperturbable, blessed tranquility now enters to contrast the pressure of his always dull, always limited willing. The sensation of this contrast, this game back and forth, is basically what expresses itself in the totality of the song, and what, in general, creates the lyrical state. In this state, pure understanding, as it were, comes to us to save us from willing and the pressure of willing. We follow along, but only moment by moment. The will, the memory of our personal goals, constantly interrupts this calm contemplation of ours, over and over again. But the next beautiful setting, in which pure will-less knowledge presents itself to us, always, once again, releases us from willing. Hence, in the song and the lyrical mood, willing, our personal interest in our own purposes, and pure contemplation in the setting which presents itself are miraculously mixed up together. We seek and imagine relationships between them both. The subjective mood, the emotional state of the will, communicates with the surroundings we contemplate, and the latter, in turn, gives its color to our mood, and a reflex action. The song is the expression of this entire emotional condition, mixed and divided in this way. World as Will and Idea, 1, 295. Who can fail to recognize in this description that here the lyric has been characterized as an incompletely realized art, a leap, as it were, which seldom attains its goal, indeed as a semi-art, whose essence must consist of the fact that the will and pure contemplation, that is, the unesthetic and aesthetic conditions, must be miraculously mixed up together. In contrast to this, we maintain that the entire opposition, which even Schopenhauer uses as a measurement of value to classify art, that opposition of the subjective and objective, has generally no place in aesthetics, since the subject, the willing individual demanding his own egotistical purposes, can only be thought of as an enemy of art, not as its origin. But insofar as the subject is an artist, he is already released from his individual willing, and has become, so to speak, a medium through which a subject of true being celebrates its redemption. For if we need to be clear on this point, above everything else, to our humiliation or ennoblement, the entire comedy of art does not present itself for us in order to make us better or to educate us. Even less so, that we should be the true creators of the art world. We should really look upon ourselves as beautiful pictures and artistic projections of the true creator, and in that significance, as works of art, we have our highest value. For only as an aesthetic phenomena are existence and the world eternally justified. Of course, our own consciousness of this significance of ours is no different from the consciousness which soldiers painted on canvas have of the battle portrayed there. Hence, our entire knowledge of art is basically completely illusory, because as knowing people, we are not one with or identical to that being who, as the single creator and spectator of that comedy of art, prepares for itself an eternal enjoyment. Only to the extent that the genius in the act of artistic creation is fused with that primordial artist of the world does he know anything about the eternal nature of art. Only in that state in which, as in the weird picture of fairy tales, he can miraculously turn his eyes and contemplate himself. Now he is simultaneously subject and object, all at once poet, actor, and spectator. This is the end of Part 1 of The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.